Here is Vinta Carlos, a nice mid-tone green that is almost boring in its delivery on the page. Boring being good because it is so consistent, predictable. Boring is beautiful. There is almost no tone variation as the paper changes. And while it does occasionally shade, the shading is in no way a standout quality. Like many Vinta inks, it can be slightly aggressive in its pursuit of the page, getting deep in there. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it is slightly aggressive and can cause some tiny feathering in some of the writing. When it comes to green inks, this gives me a beautiful mid-tone with a little bit of shading, but I like my greens to shade like camouflage. Make the almost great ink just not the one for me. It's great. It's the shading that I really want to see, that camouflage shading from this.
The pen for today is a Lamy All-Star. So now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
What a great mid-tone green that we get to see here on the Clairfontaine. It's a refreshing tone in what we're seeing. It's got some vibrancy in what's going on. It does not feather. It does not spread. The shading, while it's not huge, it can satisfy that need just a little bit when you look at satisfy here on the first line, where the S is just a little bit lighter than it was with the A, takes that mid-tone into the T, slightly darker at the I, lightens into the S, but gets a little bit darker again. Top of the F is lighter than the bottom of the F and keeps that darker version into the Y. But because this is not a huge shading ink, you will see most words without much for shading at all, like because on the second line. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue writing back here.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta. Here is Vinta Terracotta de Milly.
Here is Vinta Mascara. Here is Vinta Romblon.
Here is Vinta St. John's Laguna. The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Looking at the tone of this, we see, comparing it to the Clairfontaine, it is only ever slightly different, being just a little bit darker, but not much at all. If it wasn't for this side-by-side, you probably couldn't see it at all. And even in a side-by-side, it's so minor. It's something that I really had to bring into the computer and blow up to look at. Now, it doesn't really feather. It doesn't feather. It's not even that it doesn't really. It doesn't feather. Any spread that it has is really unnoticeable. The shading that's going on, it's not a prime situation, but it does occur on the occasion. Like prime, you see the E is just a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Why is this here? I don't know. If we look at Y on the same line, we see it's all one tone. Nice, predictable green, beautiful in its performance, great delivery. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily continue writing back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the tone of the writing, not the paper, the purpose we use this for is to be able to see if toned paper is going to change that ink. And this seems to be a fairly opaque ink. It is not having any tone shift as a result of the color of the paper. Now we're getting no feathering, we're getting no spread, no real problem in what's going on in its delivery. However, when we go looking for it, we can spot a couple moments of shading in. However, that E right in the middle is a little bit darker than the letters around it. Same with that downstroke, second part of the H, a little bit darker. It's not something that's a huge thing, but it does answer the question of if you're looking for shading. If you're not looking for a ton of shading, take a look at answer here on the third line. Generally, one tone, nice delivery. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that it gets a bit deep into the paper. This is non-fountain pen friendly paper, so that's not a surprise. It did not bleed through. It did not touch the page underneath. You could use this. You just don't plan on writing on both sides.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the tone, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. You might question whether it shades, and I'm going to say only a little bit. Take a look at that S right in the middle. But there are attempts made, like attempt on the first line, for it to shade just a little bit more, where the TTE in the middle is a little bit darker than the AM, but the P darkened up a little bit. On the most part, it's not really going to do it. Take a look at moment here on the second line, where there's no shading at all, but it is a great mid-tone green this entire time. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem with any of this here. I should go ahead and add that it stood out against the quad rule with no issues on the front side.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Shenley Park Thicket Green. Here is Colorverse Sea of Tranquility. Here is Elixir River Safari. Here is Papier Plume Forest Green. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the tone, we see that it is just a little bit lighter, just a little bit flatter a tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade a whole bunch, but if you look deliberately, or in a deliberate, so that I can make the word fit, manner, you can see with deliberate here on the second line that crossing the T and the E at the end are a little bit darker. It's not a constant thing. For the most part, it tends to just give a fairly flat tone, no problems. It stands out against the quad rule with no problem. It makes this a great ink for a student to use in their lab book. They might get a few bonus points if they did that. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have no problem at all continuing those important lab notes on the back of the page.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Lamy Bronze.
Here is Levenger Amethyst. Here is Cross Black. Here is KWZ Red Number 1. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the tone, we get practically the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. A little bit surprising there. We don't get much for feathering, nothing that would stop you from using it. We do get an expected amount of spread. It's doing fairly well. Surprisingly, that we do get a little bit of shading when you look at that on the third line, where the H is a little bit darker than the letters that are around it. I'm going to say that this is doing fairly well so far if this is the paper that you have to use it on. Looking at the back of the page, we see that it gets very deep into the paper, but not all the time. Certainly not to the point that it's going to bleed through and touch the page underneath, but probably enough that you do not write on both sides of the page.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Lamy All-Star has a drier fine nib and gives a nice mid-tone with a little shading. Now, off camera, I tried this in a dry stub to see if it would get more shading out of it. And it did get more shading, just not a ton more. It wasn't enough to say this is what I have to use to really make this go. Now, any aggressiveness on non-fountain pen friendly paper aside, this is a very consistent performer that I don't think is different pens would really make that much of a difference. So this means this ink is really for that favorite pen that you can ink up, go enjoy. This is a dealer's choice.